I stared at the envelope taped to my front door, the morning breeze tugging at its edges like it wanted to take it away. Notice of eviction, filed by my own son, the same boy I nursed through fevers, defended at school meetings, and hugged through heartbreak. Now he wanted me out. Out of the house I built, brick by brick, memory by memory. My daughter-in-law called it downsizing, but let's call it what it was: betrayal, wrapped in legal ink and sealed with my son's silence. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The September air had just started to cool in Tulsa, the kind of early morning where the grass was damp and the sun still crawled over the rooftops. Margaret Lane pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the porch to fetch the paper. That's when she saw it, an envelope slapped crooked across her front door, held in place by a strip of tape that flapped slightly in the breeze. Her pulse ticked up. Nobody taped things to doors in her neighborhood unless it was trouble, missed utility bill, code violation, or worse. She peeled it off, the tape making a loud rip that startled the sparrows off the gutter. Black print stared back at her. Notice of eviction. Filed in county court. Plaintiff, Ryan Lane. Defendant, Margaret Lane. For a moment, she couldn't move. The porch light clicked off on its timer, leaving her in daylight's full glare, clutching the envelope like a bad joke. Margaret walked back inside, closing the door carefully, as though a loud slam might break something inside her she wasn't ready to lose. She set the envelope on her kitchen table, beside the basket of pears she'd picked from the yard last week. Her hands trembled so hard one of the pears rolled free and hit the floor. She didn't bother to pick it up. The papers were real enough: legal forms, seals, signatures, Ryan's name in block letters where it didn't belong. Margaret's heart thudded against her ribs, then steadied as a strange calmness took over, the kind nurses like her learned during night shifts when lives hung by a thread. She brewed a pot of coffee with slow, mechanical movements. If this was Amber's doing, and God she knew it was, then Margaret wasn't going to face it weak-kneed. She was going to sit, sip her coffee, and look her enemy in the eye. Right on cue, the back door creaked open. Amber breezed in, heels clicking against the linoleum, perfume too sweet for the morning. She didn't bother with greetings. Instead, she slid into a chair across the table, crossing her legs like she owned the place. "You'll be more comfortable in senior housing," Amber said lightly, almost as if she were suggesting a vacation spot. "It's got to be exhausting keeping up this whole house on your own." Margaret let the words settle in the kitchen's stale quiet. She studied Amber's manicured nails tapping the tabletop, the faint smirk curling her lip. It was all a performance. Amber acting as though this was kindness instead of a knife in the back. The kitchen door eased open again. Ryan stepped in, smelling faintly of motor oil and soap, his eyes avoiding hers as he wiped his hands on his jeans. Margaret looked straight at him, searching for some crack of resistance, some sign he hadn't signed his soul away. But Ryan kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Margaret sipped her coffee, the ceramic mug steady in her hands, though her chest burned. "So this is how it's going to be," she said finally. Her voice low but carrying. Ryan swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing, still refusing to meet her eyes. Amber leaned back, smug. "It's for the best, Margaret. You'll thank us later." Margaret set her mug down, leaned forward just enough for the overhead light to catch her eyes, sharp and unwavering. "We'll see about that." Her words landed heavy, enough to make Ryan flinch. For the first time, Amber's smirk faltered. Just for a second. Outside, a lawnmower roared to life down the street, but inside that kitchen, silence stretched tight as piano wire. Margaret's calm had shifted into something else, a quiet calculation, the same steel she'd once carried through emergency rooms and midnight phone calls to grieving families. And in that silence, Margaret thought, if they think they can erase me from the home I built, they've underestimated the wrong woman. She reached for the eviction notice again, flattening the papers under her palm. The official seal stared up at her, daring her to believe it was permanent. But Margaret's lips curved, not into a smile but something colder, because she already knew what Amber didn't. Every piece of paper left a trail, and she was going to follow it. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the eviction notice pinned under the weight of her coffee mug, staring at it like it might blink first. The overhead bulb hummed faintly, casting a tired yellow circle across the wood grain. Beyond it, the rest of the house stretched into shadow, silent but alive with memories. She rose slowly, joints protesting, and went down the narrow hallway toward her bedroom. Her filing cabinet stood where it always had, tucked in the corner beneath the framed photograph of her late husband, Paul. He was smiling in the picture, sleeves rolled up, one hand braced on the porch railing he'd built. She rested her fingers on the glass for a second before she pulled open the drawer. One by one, she laid the documents across her bedspread. The deed, her name etched in thick black ink. The mortgage payoff letter stamped satisfied. Tax receipts neatly folded, each with her signature scribbled in blue ink at the bottom. Every paper smelled faintly of ink and age, but they held the solidity of stone. Amber wanted to uproot her? Margaret owned these floors, every board, every nail. She gathered the stack carefully, as if handling surgical instruments, and carried them back to the kitchen. She spread them out across the table, aligning them in precise rows. The eviction notice looked almost laughable in the middle of them, like a counterfeit dollar bill sitting beside crisp hundreds. A soft knock rattled the back screen door. Margaret froze, papers half arranged, until a familiar sing-song voice followed. "Margie? You up plotting something or just making coffee too strong again?" Margaret's shoulders eased. She unlatched the door, and there stood Dolores Carter, Dolly to everyone in the Atiu neighborhood, her silver hair tucked into a messy bun, robe flapping in the breeze like she was late for mischief. Dolly stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, nose twitching. Her sharp eyes landed on the spread of documents across the table. "Lord, that looks like trouble. What's she done now?" Margaret handed her the eviction notice without a word. Dolly perched her glasses on the end of her nose, scanning with the focus of someone who had spent a lifetime with court filings. Her lips pressed thin. I thought so." She tapped a finger against the signature line. "Honey, I filed these forms for 20 years at the clerk's office. This is trash. Wrong case number format. Wrong font on the header. Signature looks like it came off a bad copier." Margaret watched her closely. "So it's fake." "Oh, it's filed all right," Dolly said, pulling up a chair. "But whoever shoved this through didn't think anyone with half a brain would look close. If I were still behind that counter, I'd have sent this back with a red stamp before my lunch break." Together, they leaned over the papers. Dolly grabbed a pen from the counter and circled inconsistencies, muttering under her breath. "See this? County seals crooked. Clerk initials missing. And this," she jabbed at Amber's messy handwriting on the date line. "This isn't even close to the clerk's hand." Margaret's pulse steadied as she studied the mess Amber had dared to tape to her door. Fear gave way to something harder, sharper, like flint. "Amber thinks she's clever," Dolly said, sitting back with a snort. "But she's sloppy. Sloppy gets caught." Margaret let the words settle. She gathered the deed and laid it right beside the eviction notice, pressing her palm over both. Warm skin against cold paper. Her voice was steady when she said, "If she wants a war over this house, she's already lost." Dolly tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "What's your move?" Margaret didn't answer right away. The papers rustled faintly beneath her hand, like they were waiting. She looked toward the window where the streetlight buzzed outside, spilling a harsh glow into the room. The night was deep, but her mind was wide awake. She finally lifted her eyes to Dolly's, calm but edged with steel. "I'm going to make sure Amber regrets every stroke of that pen." Dolly's grin was slow, wicked, approving. "Now that's the Margie I know." But before Margaret could speak again, The crunch of tires on gravel cut through the silence. Headlights washed briefly across the curtains. A car door slammed. Margaret's chest tightened. Dolly arched an eyebrow. Someone was coming to the door. The knock came harder this time, sharp and impatient. Margaret froze. The stack of papers spread across her kitchen table like evidence in a trial. Dolly gave her a look that said, "Don't you dare panic," then padded to the window, peeking through, the curtain with the stealth of a teenager spying on a curfew break. A delivery van idled by the curb, hazard lights blinking. The driver jogged up the walk and slid a package onto the porch, oblivious to the tension hanging inside. Dolly let out a breathy laugh and shook her head. False alarm. Guess the devil drives UPS. Now Margaret's chest eased. But her fingers didn't leave the deed. Her house felt different tonight, less a home, more a fortress she had to guard. Dolly came back to the table, lowered herself into the chair, and smoothed the eviction notice with a palm. "You know," she said slowly, "this isn't the first time I've seen that woman's name." Margaret looked up, sharp. "Amber's?" "Mm-hmm." Dolly tapped the corner of the notice. Her eyes drifted past the paper, as if scanning a memory only she could see. Years ago, back when I still worked the clerk's counter, her name came across my desk more than once. Petty theft, if I remember right. A check fraud case, and I swear there was a probation violation mixed in somewhere. The kitchen seemed to shrink around them. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock. Each sound felt magnified in the silence that followed. Margaret steadied herself against the edge of the table. "Ryan doesn't know," she said, voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question, it was certainty. Dolly's eyes softened, but her tone didn't. He wouldn't have married her if he did. Margaret thought of her son, his easy laugh, the grease under his fingernails, the way he always bent under Amber's sharp words. Her stomach turned. She'd seen men ruin themselves with women who hid knives behind their smiles. She straightened, folding her arms, steel returning to her spine. Then maybe it's time he finds out. Dolly studied her, lips curling into that sly grin again. That's one way to break her chokehold, but you'll need proof. Solid proof. Margaret reached for the eviction notice, lifting it carefully. The paper crinkled between her fingers as she slid it onto her copy machine tucked beneath the hutch. The machine whirred to life, spitting out a crisp duplicate. She did it again, one copy, then another, until the counter filled with fresh pages. Evidence multiplying like ammunition. Each sheet was a weapon, and Margaret planned to fire every single one. She gathered the stack, pressing them flat, her eyes locked on Dolly. If Amber thinks she can bury her past, she's wrong. And if she thinks she can erase me from my home, she's about to learn what erasure really feels like. Dolly chuckled, low and approving, but her eyes flicked toward the darkened window again. "Careful, Margie. You're stepping into shark water. She's dangerous when cornered." Margaret's hand paused on the papers. She knew Dolly was right, but she also knew what it felt like to lose patience in the middle of the night, to sit beside grieving families and hold her own tears back. Compared to that, Amber Lane was just another opportunist with a sharpened smile. Margaret slid the fresh copies into a folder and closed it with a decisive snap. "Then I'll make sure I'm the one doing the cornering." Before Dolly could reply, the sound of footsteps drifted in from the porch. Slow, deliberate, lingering right outside the door. The screen creaked as if someone brushed against it. Margaret's eyes met Dolly's across the table. Neither woman moved. The footsteps didn't retreat. The footsteps on the porch faded into the night, leaving only the whisper of crickets beyond the window. Margaret held her breath until silence settled, heavy as lead. Whoever it was, neighbor, prowler, or Amber herself, had gone. But the message was clear. Eyes were on her house. By morning, she'd made up her mind. If Amber wanted to play games with paper and signatures, Margaret was going to fight with the same weapons, and sharper ones. Tulsa's strip mall law office looked unimpressive from the outside, wedged between a payday loan store and a nail salon with neon lights buzzing. Inside, though, the air smelled of old coffee and ink toner, and the walls were lined with mismatched law books. Margaret stepped in with her folder clutched tight against her chest. Behind the cluttered desk sat Ben Harper, blue tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, grin too easy for a man who wrestled with other people's wars for a living. He waved her in, gesturing to the chair opposite. "What have we got here?" he asked, voice warm but sharp with curiosity. Margaret slid the folder across the desk. Ben flipped it open, brows rising as he scanned the eviction notice, then the deed, mortgage payoff, and tax receipts. His pen twirled between his fingers as he muttered to himself, a habit born of repetition and habit. When he finally looked up, there was a gleam in his eye that Margaret hadn't seen in years. Not pity, not dismissal. Focus. "This is bogus," he said flatly. "Sloppy. Won't last 2 minutes in front of a judge." He tapped the notice with the back of his pen. "Whoever drafted this thought you'd scare easy and cave. They were dead wrong." A slow burn of satisfaction lit in Margaret's chest. But she didn't come here for comfort. "I want more than dismissal," she said, steady as stone. Ben leaned back, chair creaking. "Figures. Most people just want the mess to go away. You want to flip it? I want her exposed," Margaret said, voice low, public and permanent. The corner of Ben's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then we dig." He tapped the pen against the folder again, rhythm deliberate. "We get her passed on the record. If she's got skeletons, we'll drag everyone into daylight. But you've got to be ready. Once it's public, there's no stuffing it back in." Margaret's eyes didn't waver. "Good. That's exactly what I want." Ben studied her for a long moment, as though measuring whether she meant it. Finally, he scribbled notes in the margin of a legal pad, the ink scratching quick and decisive. "All right, first step, motion to dismiss. I'll file it today. That buys us breathing room. Then we start digging. Records office, prior cases, any probation trail she left behind." He looked back at her. "You sure you're ready to scorch earth?" Margaret's lips curved into that same cold, near smile she'd worn the night before. "I've spent my life cleaning up other people's messes. This one, I'm going to burn to the ground." Ben chuckled, not unkindly, and slid the folder back toward her. "Then we're in business." As Margaret stood, the weight of the papers felt different now, not fear, but ammunition. She clutched them close, already imagining the moment Amber's polished mask cracked in court. But as she reached for the door, Ben's voice followed her, softer but edged with warning. "Be careful. People like her don't fold easy." "They strike back." Margaret paused, hand on the knob, then let her try. She stepped into the hallway, heels clicking on the linoleum floor. Outside, the sky had darkened into a stormy gray, clouds rolling heavy over Tulsa. The air smelled of rain, metallic and electric. Margaret pulled her coat tighter, the folder under her arm, and thought, if Amber wants a fight, she just picked the wrong battlefield. Lightning flickered across the sky, quick and sharp, throwing her reflection in the office window for an instant. Strong, resolute, unyielding. Then thunder rolled, low and ominous, as if answering back. By the time the storm broke over Tulsa, Margaret had everything she needed. Rain lashed against her windows, rattling the gutters, while she spread fresh printouts from the county records office across her kitchen table. Amber's name appeared again and again, each line like a bruise: fraud, petty theft, probation violation. The papers smelled faintly of toner, still warm from the printer when she'd pulled them. Proof. Unshakable, public, permanent proof. She didn't wait long. Ryan came over after his shift at the garage, damp from the storm, hair sticking to his forehead. He dropped his keys in the bowl by the door, avoiding her eyes the way he had the night Amber taped that notice to her door. "Sit," Margaret said. Not a plea, not even a suggestion. A command. Ryan hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair across from her, His hands were still stained with grease, but they shook when he rested them on the table. Margaret slid the stack of court records toward him. She didn't speak at first. She just watched as he frowned, then picked them up. His lips moved silently as he read. Misdemeanor theft, check fraud, probation violation for failing to report. Dates spanning years he thought he knew Amber. His face drained of color, like oil slipping out of an engine. This... His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. This isn't possible. Margaret folded her hands, her gaze steady. It's not only possible. It's true. And it's public record. Ryan shook his head, clutching the pages as though he could crush the words out of existence. No, she would have told me. She would have... The back door slammed open, and Amber stormed in, soaked from the rain but still holding herself like she owned the room. Her heels clicked against the linoleum, echoing sharp as a gavel. She's lying, Amber's voice sliced through the kitchen. Ryan, don't listen to her. She's twisting things. You know how she is. Ryan looked up at her, face pale, hands trembling with the papers still clutched between them. Amber crossed the room quickly, snatched at the records, but Margaret's hand shot out first, pinning them under her palm. Go ask the county clerk, Margaret said, her voice cool and cutting. They'll tell you the same thing I just did. Every word stamped and filed. Amber's eyes flashed. Mascara smudged from the storm, but Margaret didn't look away. For the first time in years, she saw panic beneath Amber's polish. Ryan's breathing grew shallow. He pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping the floor. His eyes darted between his wife and his mother, as though the walls themselves had shifted. Amber reached for him, nails grazing his arm. Don't let her do this to us. She's trying to break us apart, Ryan. She always has. Ryan yanked his arm back, the motion jerky, unsteady. He pressed a hand against his forehead, as though holding his skull together. Margaret stayed silent, watching. She didn't need to twist the knife. Amber's past was already doing that for her. The rain outside grew heavier, pounding the roof like fists. Ryan's chest heaved. Finally, he whispered, I need to think. He shoved the records back onto the table and staggered toward the hallway, shoulders slumped. He looked sick, like the ground under him had given way. Amber spun on Margaret, eyes blazing. You don't know what you've started. Margaret leaned forward slowly, the papers spread between them like a battlefield. Her voice was calm, almost kind. Oh, Amber. I've only just begun. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating Amber's face twisted with rage. Then just as quickly, darkness swallowed her features again. The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and rain-soaked coats, the air heavy with the weight of other people's battles. Margaret walked through its double doors with her chin level and her steps measured, the click of her heels steady on the tiled floor. Every nerve inside her vibrated, but outwardly she was stone. Ben Harper led the way, briefcase swinging casually at his side, as though this were just another Tuesday. Margaret clutched her folder of documents close, not because she doubted Ben, but because she needed the weight of proof against her chest. When the bailiff called her case, she rose and entered the courtroom. Amber was already seated at the opposing table, polished within an inch of her life, hair shellacked, suit crisp, lips painted a bold red that screamed control. But Margaret saw the tremor in her hand as she shuffled her papers. Ryan sat behind her, a hollow figure, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the table. Margaret didn't look at him. Not yet. All rise, the bailiff called, and the judge entered, robe swaying, face carved from granite. They all sat, and Amber leapt to her feet, papers in hand. Your Honor, she began, voice sweetened with false confidence. This is a simple matter. My mother-in-law has been living in a house that should rightfully belong to her son, my husband, and myself. Here are the eviction papers, properly filed. She thrust the notice forward, shaking it slightly for effect. The judge frowned, adjusted his glasses, and gestured toward Ben. "Mr. Harper!" Ben rose smoothly, unhurried, and laid a neat stack of documents on the bench. "With respect, Your Honor, the notice Mrs. Lane received is riddled with errors, wrong formatting, improper seals, and a signature that barely passes inspection. More importantly, here are the deed, mortgage payoff, and tax receipts. All solely in my client's name. No co-signers, no joint ownership, no ambiguity. This home belongs entirely to Mrs. Lane." The papers landed with a satisfying weight. Margaret kept her eyes forward, her face calm, but her pulse thrummed in her throat. The judge flipped through the documents, his brow lifting as he read. The silence in the courtroom thickened, broken only by the shuffling of pages. Finally, he set the papers down and looked directly at Amber. "This house," he said, voice resonant, "is Mrs. Lane's alone. The eviction filing is dismissed." The words cracked through the room like thunder. Amber flushed red, her lips parting as though she might argue, but no sound came. She sank back into her chair, nails digging into her folder. Behind her, Ryan lowered his head into his hands. He didn't look at Margaret, wouldn't. His shame filled the space louder than words. Margaret allowed herself only a small exhale, a release of breath she'd held since the bailiff called her name. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Victory here wasn't triumph, it was survival. The judge banged his gavel. Case closed. Amber shot Margaret a glare that could have cut glass, but Margaret met it without flinching. For a moment, two women stared across the gulf of the courtroom, one burning with humiliation, the other with unshakable resolve. Then Amber leaned close to Ryan, her words too low to catch, but her expression venomous. Ryan stiffened, still refusing to meet his mother's gaze. Margaret gathered her papers, rose slowly, and walked out with Ben at her side. But as the heavy doors closed, behind her, her stomach tightened. Because dismissal was only the beginning. Amber Lane had just been humiliated in open court, and Margaret knew women like Amber didn't retreat. They retaliated. The courthouse smelled different the second time, less like dust and polish, more like blood in the water. Margaret walked in beside Ben Harper, her spine straight, her folder under one arm, and her jaw set. This wasn't defense anymore. This was offense. Amber sat at the opposing table again, lips drawn tight, fury disguised as poise. Ryan trailed behind her, head bent, as if the floor might open up and swallow him whole. The bailiff called the case. Margaret rose, calm as stone, while Ben stood at her side, legal pad in hand. Amber launched first. "Your Honor, this has gone far enough. Margaret is using the system to harass me." The judge raised a hand, silencing her. "Mrs. Lane, Mr. Harper, you requested time to submit further documents." Ben nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We believe this information is critical to the court's understanding of the petitioner's credibility." He opened Margaret's folder and placed 3 stapled packets on the judge's bench. The paper slid across the polished wood with a whisper, but the sound felt like a gunshot. The judge flipped through the pages, eyebrows climbing higher with each one. Petty theft, check fraud, a probation violation. These are not minor missteps, Mrs. Lane. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ryan stiffened behind Amber, his hand gripping the back of the bench until his knuckles whitened. Amber bolted upright, voice rising an octave too high. "That's ancient history. It has nothing to do with this." Ben stepped forward, calm, almost casual. "With respect, Your Honor, it has everything to do with this." Mrs. Lane attempted to use fraudulent documents to seize property she had no legal right to. Her history of fraud and theft is not just relevant, it's a pattern the court cannot ignore. Amber's face blanched, then darkened, her chest rising and falling as she searched for footing. She pointed a trembling finger at Margaret. "She's dredging this up just to destroy me." Margaret rose then, smooth and deliberate, her voice quiet but carrying. "Then why hide it? The words landed heavy, like a hammer on glass. Amber froze, her mouth still open but no words spilling out. Ryan's eyes finally lifted, this time to his wife. And Margaret saw the sickness in them, the dawning realization that the foundation of his marriage had been built on lies. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. "This paints a picture," he said slowly, eyes locked on Amber. "And it is not one of credibility." Amber's veneer cracked. She slammed her palm against the table, the sound jolting through the room. "You don't get to do this to me, none of you." The bailiff shifted, ready to step in, but the judge's glare froze Amber in place. Margaret didn't move, didn't blink. She simply lowered herself back into her chair, the faintest trace of satisfaction tugging at the corner of her mouth. But inside, she knew this wasn't victory yet. Amber wasn't the kind of woman to crumble after one strike. No, this was only gasoline on the fire. The gavel banged once, sharp as a gunshot. "This matter will be revisited with these records entered into evidence." Court adjourned. Amber sank into her chair, eyes wild, lips pressed into a thin, shaking line. Ryan stayed frozen, staring at the stack of papers that had just shattered whatever illusions he had left. Margaret gathered her things, rose, and walked out with Ben at her side. The murmurs of the gallery swirled behind her, thick with gossip. Outside the courthouse doors, the air was heavy with humidity, storm clouds still bruising the sky. Margaret tightened her grip on her folder. She didn't look back, but she felt Amber's gaze burning into her spine. And she knew Amber's next move was already loading. The ride home from the courthouse was silent. Margaret drove her own car, while Ryan and Amber left together in his truck. She had not asked him to ride with her, nor had she wanted to. Some silences are necessary. They stretch like wire, taut and dangerous, until they finally snap. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the evening air was damp and close, carrying the smell of wet pavement and cut grass. She parked beneath the porch light and sat for a moment, letting the engine tick as it cooled, listening to her own breath. Inside, her house felt different. It was no longer just walls and rooms. It was battleground territory, a place where the truth had been dragged into daylight. She set her folder down on the counter and poured herself a glass of water, her hands steady in a way they hadn't been in days. The storm that had hung over her seemed to have shifted. Not vanished. No, she wasn't naive, but shifted. The weight was no longer pressing solely on her shoulders. Ryan carried part of it now, whether he wanted to or not. It didn't take long for voices to rise, at first muffled, then sharper, cutting through the stillness of the house. They came from the other side of the wall, the spare bedroom where Ryan and Amber sometimes stayed when tempers ran too hot to share a bed. Margaret froze, glass in hand, then moved quietly toward the hallway. She didn't intend to intrude, but the words carried clear and sharp through plaster that had stood for 50 years. Ryan's voice came first, rough and shaking with betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" Amber's reply was quick, defensive, and high-pitched. The sound of a cornered animal. "It was years ago, Ryan. It doesn't matter anymore." Margaret leaned lightly against the wall, closing her eyes. She had known this would come, had counted on it. But hearing her son's pain in those words still cut deep, even as a darker satisfaction curled underneath. Ryan's chair scraped against the hardwood floor. His voice was louder now, breaking. "It matters when you use my name to try and kick my mom out of her own house. Don't you get that? It matters when you drag me into it." There was silence then, sharp and brittle. Margaret could almost picture Amber's face, the way her eyes would narrow, the way she would search for just the right thread of manipulation to pull. When Amber finally spoke, her tone had shifted, slick with sugar and desperation. "Ryan, I did what I had to do for us, for our future. She doesn't care about you like I do." She never has. Margaret's throat tightened at that lie. But before the ache could rise, Ryan's voice cracked through, harder this time, carrying a note she had not heard in years. Anger he no longer swallowed. "Don't you dare put this on her. Don't you dare! There was a dull thud, the unmistakable sound of his fist hitting the table. Margaret pressed her palm against the wall, steadying herself. She wasn't sure if it was to keep her balance or to silently lend strength to her son on the other side. Behind her, the back door creaked open. Dolly slipped inside with the quiet familiarity of someone who had walked that path 100 times. She wore her robe still, hair pinned carelessly, but her eyes were sharp. She tilted her head listening before speaking in a whisper that was both amused and reverent. Truth shakes houses faster than tornadoes. Margaret glanced at her neighbor, lips pressing into the faintest smile. And this one deserves to fall. The voices swelled again, Amber's pleading now tangled with fury, Ryan's words firm but breaking, both of them circling the wreckage of their marriage. And then, sudden finality. The heavy slam of a door, footsteps pounding down the hall. Margaret's heart jumped as she caught the silhouette of her son passing the window, shoulders rigid, keys clenched in his fist. The truck engine roared to life, headlights cutting across the driveway like a spotlight. Dolly and Margaret stood side by side in the kitchen, silent as they listened to the tires spin against wet gravel, the sound fading into the distance. Amber's voice did not follow. The house was quiet now, unnervingly so, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the echo of what had just broken. Margaret lifted her glass of water and took a slow sip, the coolness sliding down her throat, steadying her. Ryan was gone, for now. Amber remained, somewhere in the other room, her silence thick and heavy as smoke. Margaret knew this wasn't over. The marriage had cracked, yes, but cracks don't always lead to collapse. Sometimes they make people desperate, reckless, dangerous, and Margaret could already feel it in her bones. Amber wasn't about to let go without drawing more blood. The morning after Ryan's truck tore down her driveway, Margaret woke to the sound of rain easing against the gutters. It was the kind of soft, steady rainfall that usually calmed her nerves, but today her chest carried a different kind of weight. The house was quiet, too quiet. Ryan had not come home, and Amber had barricaded herself in the guest room. Margaret moved through her kitchen with deliberate care, brewing coffee, setting her cup on the table, forcing herself into the ritual of normalcy. But she knew it was only the calm before the next strike, and it came swiftly. By the following week, Margaret found herself back in the courthouse, summoned not by Amber's eviction nonsense this time, but by something more absurd. A request for a restraining order. The petition was laughable, even to her eyes, pages filled with melodramatic claims that Margaret had threatened violence, that she had harassed Amber, that she was unsafe to be around. Amber's handwriting crawled across the forms in looping exaggerations, the ink smudged in places where she had pressed too hard, as if aggression could substitute for truth. When her case was called, Amber swept into the courtroom with her chin high, dressed in another carefully chosen suit, navy blue this time, as though fabric could cloak desperation. Her voice carried when she addressed the judge, trembling with false indignation. "Your Honor, I live in fear every day. My mother-in-law has become unstable. She's threatened me. She's stalked me. She's trying to ruin my life." The gallery behind them stirred, murmurs, a few raised brows. Margaret sat quietly beside Ben Harper, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face composed. She did not need to interrupt. Amber's own words were already doing the work for her. The judge, a different one than before, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the petition with an expression that bordered on disbelief. "Mrs. Lane, this filing is thin. Do you have any evidence, texts, recordings, witnesses, to support your claims?" Amber blinked rapidly, her cheeks flushing as she shuffled her stack of papers. "Well, no, not exactly, but—" Ben rose smoothly, his voice steady but edged with dry humor. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a retaliatory filing. My client has not threatened or harassed Mrs. Lane. Quite the opposite. Mrs. Lane, my client, was the one dragged into court over a fraudulent eviction filing that your colleague dismissed just last week. A chuckle rippled through the gallery. Even the bailiff smothered a smirk. The judge sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Mrs. Lane, I don't appreciate my courtroom being used for petty warfare. Your petition is without merit. Not only is it denied, but I am ordering you to pay court costs for wasting judicial time. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Amber's mouth fell open, but no words came. Her face burned crimson, her composure cracking like glass under heat. She gathered her papers in shaking hands, but the whispering from the gallery had already begun to spread like wildfire. Margaret rose, slowly, dignity intact, her shoulders squared as she turned toward the exit. She paused just long enough to let her words fall with measured weight, not to the judge, not to Ben, but directly within Amber's earshot. She wanted silence. She got an audience. Amber flinched as though struck. By the time Margaret stepped outside, the fallout was already beginning. Tulsa was not a large city when it came to gossip, especially in the tight-knit suburban circles where Amber liked to play queen bee. That evening at the neighborhood association barbecue, whispers circulated beneath the hum of cicadas and the smoke of the grill. Parents from the local school murmured over paper plates about Amber's criminal record, about the judge's words, about the restraining order stunt that had backfired spectacularly. Margaret stood off to the side with Dolly, sipping sweet tea, her posture relaxed, but her ears tuned to every snippet. She tried to evict his mother, one woman gasped, her hand frozen halfway to her mouth. Filed a fake restraining order too, another chimed in. It wasn't long before Sharon from the HOA, a woman who ruled over block committees like a senator in pearls, made her way over, her voice dripping with finality. We don't want her on the committee anymore. We can't have that kind of behavior representing our neighborhood. Margaret only nodded, saying nothing, but inside, she felt a quiet, steady satisfaction blooming. This was the kind of punishment Amber had never anticipated, not from a gavel, but from whispers that spread through living rooms and playgrounds, from reputations that cracked faster than glass once the first stone was thrown. Across the lawn, Amber lingered near the edge of the crowd, clutching a glass of wine that did nothing to steady her. She caught Margaret's gaze for just a moment before turning sharply away, her shoulders tight, her face pale beneath the porch lights. It was sinking in. Her marriage was fracturing. Her court gambits had failed. And now, the very social circles she relied upon were closing against her like doors locked from the inside. But Margaret knew better than to think this would be the end. A cornered woman still had claws, and Amber Lane had not yet shown how deep hers could cut. The days after the barbecue felt strangely quiet, as if the neighborhood itself had turned its back on Amber. Word spread quickly in places like Tulsa's suburbs. Parents whispered at soccer practice. Neighbors traded knowing looks at the grocery store, and even the cashier at the hardware store asked Margaret if she had heard the latest. For once, the rumors were not circling her. They were circling Amber. Ryan showed up at Margaret's house one evening, his shoulders slumped, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. He didn't knock. He never had to. He simply pushed open the back door and stood in the kitchen like a boy who had lost his way. Margaret didn't rush to him. She gave him the quiet, let him find his own words. Finally, he sank into a chair, rubbing his face with both hands. "I can't go back there tonight," he muttered. His voice was hoarse, frayed at the edges. Margaret poured him coffee and set it down without a word. He stared at the steam curling from the cup before finally lifting his eyes. "She lied to me, Mom. For years. I kept defending her, making excuses, and she—" His voice broke. He pressed his palms harder against his face. "I don't even know who I married anymore." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, for the first time since this war began. He didn't flinch from her touch. "You'll figure it out," she said softly, "but you won't do it alone." For 2 nights, Ryan stayed in the spare bedroom. Margaret heard him pacing in the dark, talking to himself, opening and closing drawers like a man searching for something he wasn't sure existed. He helped her patch a loose gutter on the porch, fix the squeak in the front door hinge, and even mowed the yard, each act wordless but heavy with meaning. It wasn't just penance, it was an attempt to root himself again where he truly belonged. Amber, of course, didn't take the absence quietly. On the third night, just as the sun was bleeding out of the sky, Margaret heard the slam of a car door in the driveway, followed by frantic pounding on her front door. "Ryan!" Amber's voice was sharp, cracking with fury and desperation. "Ryan, come home! This isn't funny." Ryan froze in the kitchen, the wrench he had been using to tighten a cabinet handle still clutched in his hand. His jaw tightened, and after a long pause, he set the tool down carefully, like a man steeling himself before a fight. He walked to the door, opened it just enough to face her, the porch light spilling across her pale, frantic face. "Not until you're honest," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but it carried a finality that made Amber recoil. Amber's eyes flicked past him and landed on Margaret, who stood a few steps behind her son, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "She's poisoning you against me," Amber hissed. "You can't see it, but she's manipulating everything." Margaret's gaze didn't waver. Her voice was low and even, a blade sliding from its sheath. "Honesty's not her language, Ryan." "You've heard it yourself." Amber's mouth opened, ready to snap back, but Ryan closed the door before she could find the words. The sound of the lock sliding into place was louder than her fists pounding the wood a moment later. Eventually, her heels clicked angrily across the driveway, followed by the roar of her car as it tore down the street. Later that week, Ben Harper came by with a fresh stack of paperwork. He set it on Margaret's kitchen table, tapping the top page with the ease of a man who liked delivering good news. "Filed and signed by the judge. She's barred from bringing any more property claims against you." Permanently, Margaret let the weight of the words sink in. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to lean back in her chair, to feel the fight shift entirely in her favor. "So that's one door she can't kick open again." Ben smiled faintly. "Exactly." Dolly arrived, not long after, carrying a pie still warm from the oven. She set it down with a flourish, the sugary scent filling the room. "Victory food," she declared. "Eat while it's hot. Cold revenge is fine for gossip, but warm pie does more for the soul." Margaret laughed softly, the sound startling even herself. For a moment, the house felt like a home again, a place of safety, of family, of small comforts reclaimed. Ryan ate silently, but the way he leaned back in his chair, the way his shoulders eased, told Margaret more than words could. Yet as night settled in and the last crumbs were scraped from the pie tin, Margaret stood on the porch alone, staring out into the dark street. The wind stirred the trees, and the distant hum of a car engine made her tense. She couldn't shake the certainty curling in her chest. Amber was not finished. And the next time she came, it wouldn't be with papers or pleadings. It would be something sharper. Amber's next strike didn't come to Margaret's doorstep. It came through a glowing screen. Late one evening, as Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea cooling in her hands, Dolly slid her phone across the table with a raised eyebrow. "She's at it again," she said. Margaret tilted the phone and saw Amber's name blazing across a Facebook post. The photo at the top was of Amber, chin tilted high, makeup done too perfectly for a casual selfie. The caption beneath was a tirade. "Imagine being harassed by someone who should be family. Imagine being threatened in your own home. I've given everything for Ryan, but his mother will never stop trying to tear us apart. Some people don't know when to let go." The comments section was already alive with reactions. A few sympathetic replies trickled in. Women Amber knew from her yoga class or the PTA. "Stay strong, girl. Mothers-in-law can be the worst." But Margaret noticed how fast the likes stalled. People were watching, yes, but they weren't piling in behind her the way Amber had hoped. "Let her spin her little web," Dolly muttered. "Spiders forget. Every web can be torn down." Margaret didn't respond right away. She simply opened her own phone, navigated to her files, and began scrolling through the screenshots she had already saved. Copies of Amber's bogus eviction notice, screenshots of the court records showing theft, fraud, and probation violation. Every receipt filed and stamped. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Amber to overplay her hand. That night, while Amber slept in the smug certainty of her own performance, Margaret posted 3 simple images to her own profile. No long captions, no rants, just the papers, bold black text against white, with the county's seal stamped clear as day. She added one line beneath them. Receipts speak louder than stories. The reaction was immediate. Within an hour, comments poured in, not under Amber's post, but under Margaret's. Wait, she tried to evict you? Ryan's name was on this? Oh my God, check fraud. Are we reading this right? The polite masks of suburban life cracked in the comments section, judgment spilling out unfiltered. By morning, Amber's Facebook had become a battlefield. The same women who had once chirped encouragement now pulled back. This doesn't look good, Amber. Why wouldn't you tell him about this before marriage? You tried to evict his own mother? Margaret didn't bother commenting again. She didn't need to. The document spoke louder than anything she could type. Dolly watched the feed light up over breakfast, laughing into her coffee. Lord, she thought she'd start a pity parade. Looks like she built her own funeral procession instead. Amber tried to fight back. She posted a new status a few hours later, claiming the records were old, irrelevant, dredged up to humiliate a good woman who only wanted to build a life. She attached a photo of herself wiping at her eye, as if tears could erase ink on paper. But the replies came sharp and unkind now. Ancient history. You filed that eviction last month. You can't blame your MIL when you forged documents. Good woman. Not from what the judge said. By the end of the day, Amber began deleting comments. By the next morning, the entire post vanished, swallowed by shame. But Margaret knew the screenshots were already out there, saved, shared, whispered about in text threads and private groups. Once something hit the internet, it never truly disappeared. Ryan saw it all. He didn't say much, but Margaret caught him standing at the counter that evening, scrolling slowly through his phone, shoulders hunched. When he finally set it down, he shook his head with a bitterness that cut deeper than anger. She'll never stop lying, he said quietly, almost to himself. Margaret watched him for a long moment, then turned back to her tea. You can't polish dirt, Ryan. No matter how hard you rub, it just muddies the water. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere in the neighborhood. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the window, a chill running up her spine. She had won this round, yes. Amber had lost control of her own narrative. But Margaret knew the silence after a public humiliation was the most dangerous kind, because that was when Amber would decide how far she was willing to go to claw her way back. The neighborhood gossip was still smoldering when Ben Harper called Margaret one Tuesday morning. She was sitting on her porch with Dolly, a second cup of coffee in her hand, when her phone buzzed. Margaret, Ben said, his tone brisk, businesslike, but laced with something more, opportunity. The prosecutor's office is interested. Your daughter-in-law's little stunt with the eviction notice might be the thread that unravels the rest of her history. They're reopening her file. Margaret's hand tightened on her mug. Reopening? She's got priors, Ben reminded her. Fraud, theft, probation violation. Add this recent mess, and you've got a pattern. A pattern courts don't ignore, but they'll want your help. Timeline, documentation, anything that shows this wasn't an isolated slip. Margaret set the mug down carefully, her pulse steadying into something sharper. Then they'll have it. That afternoon, her dining table turned into a command center. Files, receipts, and photocopies were spread out in precise rows, each one a thread in Amber's web of lies. Margaret worked with the focus of a nurse preparing for surgery. Dolly perched nearby with her glasses halfway down her nose, handing over sticky notes and highlighters like an eager assistant. Don't forget the Facebook screenshots, Dolly said. Those comments, they're dynamite. Public record of her painting herself the victim. Right after the judge tossed her claims, Margaret slid them into a folder. Every lie deserves its own spotlight. By the time Ben arrived to collect the evidence, The table was a battlefield of ink and paper. He leafed through it, nodding. This is more than enough. They'll move fast, and they did. Within weeks, Amber received notice. She was being summoned to appear for a fraud hearing. Margaret heard about it not from Amber herself but from Ryan, who brought the letter home still sealed, his hands shaking as he set it on the counter. "She didn't even tell me," he whispered, the words carrying more sorrow than surprise. "I found it stuffed under a pile of junk mail." Like she thought if she ignored it, it might disappear. Margaret reached across the counter, steadying his trembling hand. "That's what liars do, Ryan. They hide until the truth drags them out." When the day of the hearing arrived, Margaret walked into the courthouse with Ryan beside her. His shoulders were slumped, but he matched her stride, his silence heavy with shame and grim loyalty. Margaret felt his presence like a weight against her side. For years, Amber had stood between them, wedge after wedge, excuse after excuse. Now, he was choosing where to sit. Inside the courtroom, Amber was already at her table, alone. She had no lawyer this time. Either she couldn't afford one, or none had been willing to gamble their reputation on her case. She looked smaller than Margaret had ever seen her, her polished armor cracking. Her hands trembled as she shuffled her papers, her eyes darting toward the gallery where whispers had already begun to stir. The judge entered, robe sweeping, expression grave. He glanced at the prosecutor, then at the stack of files Ben had delivered in advance. "Mrs. Lane," he said, voice cool and steady, "your record suggests a pattern of deception. This court will examine not only your prior offenses, but your recent attempt to file fraudulent eviction papers against your mother-in-law." Amber's head jerked up, her face blanching. "That wasn't fraud," she sputtered. "It was a mistake, just a mistake." The prosecutor stepped forward, unflinching. "Your Honor, we have documented evidence of repeated deception over a span of years. This is no mistake. It's character. And the court deserves to see it clearly." Margaret sat straighter, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face unreadable. Ryan sat beside her, hunched forward, his eyes fixed on Amber. She tried to catch his gaze, to pull him back with the old tricks, tilting her chin, softening her voice, but he did not move. He did not blink. Amber was alone, trembling under the fluorescent lights, the silence of the room louder than any gavel. The judge raised a hand, signaling for order. "This matter will proceed to full examination. Mrs. Lane, you are required to return to this court with all relevant documentation. Consider this your formal summons." The gavel cracked once, echoing across the chamber. Amber flinched at the sound, and for the first time since Margaret had known her, the younger woman looked truly cornered. But Margaret's eyes stayed steady on her. She had waited for this moment, for Amber to finally face a room she couldn't manipulate, a stage she couldn't control. And she knew the next act was going to break her. The final hearing drew a larger crowd than Margaret expected. Word had spread far beyond the neighborhood barbecue or the Facebook threads. People came out of curiosity, out of habit, or just for the satisfaction of seeing someone who had thought herself untouchable finally dragged low. Margaret walked into the courthouse with Ryan beside her. His face was pale, but his stride matched hers now, measured, deliberate. He carried no folder, no stack of evidence, just the hollow determination of a man who had decided he could not live inside a lie any longer. Margaret didn't squeeze his arm, didn't offer reassurance. She knew better. Some roads had to be walked alone, even if she walked beside him. Amber was already at the defendant's table. Her suit was wrinkled this time, her hair pinned too tightly, and her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. She looked less like the polished woman Margaret had first mistrusted years ago, and more like what she truly was, a desperate pretender, clinging to scraps of control. The judge began with no ceremony. "Mrs. Lane, after reviewing your prior record and your recent conduct, this court finds you guilty of probation violation and attempted fraud. Your repeated pattern of deception leaves the court no choice." His words were clipped, merciless. Amber's breath hitched audibly. She clutched the edge of her table as though bracing against a storm. Your probation will be extended for another 2 years, the judge continued. You are sentenced to 200 hours of community service. Furthermore, you are ordered to repay all court costs and damages associated with these proceedings. Failure to comply will result in harsher sentencing. The gavel struck once, but the sound seemed to reverberate longer this time, as if the entire room had been waiting for it. Amber sagged into her chair, trembling. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ryan's shoulders slumped, but he did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his hands clasped together in front of him, like he was holding himself in place. When the session adjourned, he finally turned to Margaret. His voice was low, almost ashamed, but resolute. I'm filing for separation. Margaret didn't flinch. She only nodded once, her face steady. She had known this moment would come, had even prayed for it in her quiet way. But seeing her son say the words, choosing the severance himself, was something heavier than victory. It was grief, but also relief, woven together in equal measure. Amber tried once as they gathered their things to reach for him. Ryan, please, she whispered, her voice hoarse, her hand trembling in the air between them. Don't let her do this. I can fix it. We can fix it. Ryan pulled back, his expression flat, empty of the warmth he used to give so freely. You already broke it, Amber. And you kept breaking it every day you lied. The silence after those words was more final than the gavel. Outside, the courthouse, Dolly was waiting at the bottom of the steps, leaning on the railing like she'd been planted there by fate. She eyed Margaret's calm face, then Amber's retreating figure, shoulders hunched as she stumbled toward her car, and shook her head. Well, Dolly said, her voice carrying both satisfaction and a little awe. That's what we call full circle. Margaret didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply looked past the parking lot to the horizon, where the clouds were breaking just enough to let a slant of sunlight through. She felt no triumph, only the steady rhythm of her own breath, proof that she was still standing in the house of her life when someone else had tried so hard to push her out of it. But deep inside, beneath the calm surface, she knew one thing with a certainty that chilled her. Amber Lane was down, yes, but not destroyed. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the world was a person with nothing left to lose. The days after Amber's sentencing slid into a rhythm Margaret had almost forgotten. The house, once heavy with tension, felt lighter now, air flowing freely through its rooms, instead of being choked by whispers and slammed doors. She found herself waking earlier, rising before the sun, slipping out into the backyard where the soil was still damp with morning dew. With her gloves pulled on and her knees sunk into the earth, she tended to the flower beds that had gone neglected while she fought courtroom battles. Petunias, half strangled by weeds, now had room to bloom. Hydrangeas she'd planted years ago responded to her touch as if they had been waiting. Each weed she yanked from the soil came up with a satisfying rip, the roots exposed, the earth breathing easier. From the open kitchen window, she heard the scrape of a chair and the rattle of tools. Ryan had taken to repairing things around the house in the evenings. At first, he worked quietly, ashamed, as if fixing hinges or patching drywall could erase years of choices. But as the days wore on, his silence softened. He began to talk while he worked, about jobs at the shop, about a car that wouldn't start, about how strange it felt to be living back in his childhood home. His voice was still tentative, but Margaret let it be. Healing, she knew, didn't need to be hurried. One afternoon, Dolly wandered into the yard, her wide-brimmed hat crooked on her head, a glass of lemonade sweating in her hand. She stood at the edge of the garden, surveying Margaret on her knees among the flowers. Funny, Dolly said, her voice carrying that sly mix of humor and truth she'd perfected over 70 years. How fast peace grows once weeds are gone. Margaret brushed dirt from her gloves, sat back on her heels, and looked up at her neighbor. Her eyes were steady, calm, but edged with something deeper. "I didn't pull weeds," she said quietly. "I dug up roots." Dolly smiled, not unkindly, but with approval that glimmered like sunlight across glass. "And that's why it'll last this time." That evening, as Ryan fixed a loose shutter on the porch, the mail truck rattled down the street and came to a stop in front of the house. The driver left a small stack of envelopes in the box. Margaret walked down the path to retrieve them, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes. Most were bills, advertisements, the usual clutter of modern life, but one envelope stood apart. Official, crisp, stamped with the county court seal. Margaret slid it open carefully at the kitchen table. Inside was a check. Amber's restitution, court-ordered repayment for the damages she had caused. The amount wasn't large, not compared to the stress and years stolen, but it was something tangible. A receipt, a symbol that even Amber couldn't deny what she had tried to do. Margaret held the check for a long moment, her fingers brushing across the ink. Then she rose, walked down the hall to her bedroom, and opened the filing cabinet beneath Paul's old photograph. From the top drawer, she pulled a thick binder, the one she had built piece by piece through this ordeal. Eviction notice copies, court filings, screenshots, every scrap of evidence that had exposed Amber for what she was. She slid the check into a plastic sleeve at the very back of the binder, pressing it flat before closing the cover with a quiet snap. On the spine, in neat black letters, she had written 2 words: evidence and closure. The house was quiet around her, the kind of quiet that used to ache but now felt earned. Ryan's footsteps creaked softly above her. Dolly's laughter drifted faintly from the yard where she chatted with another neighbor, and the air smelled of lilacs carried through the window by the breeze. Margaret set the binder back in its drawer, shut it, and stood still for a moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of her house, the same house someone else had tried to take from her, the same house she had defended, board by board, truth by truth. But as peace settled into her chest, she felt it, the faintest whisper in her bones. Peace was never permanent. It had to be guarded, tended like a garden, protected from whatever weeds might try to take root again. And Margaret Lane was ready. By the time autumn rolled into Tulsa, the air carried a crispness that made even the most ordinary days feel sharpened, more defined. Margaret stood on her porch with a box of decorations at her feet, bundles of dried corn, a pair of carved pumpkins, and a wreath of orange and red leaves she had bought years ago at a craft fair. She set each piece carefully, her movements steady, deliberate, like she was claiming every inch of this house all over again. The boards beneath her feet creaked with the familiar groan of age, but instead of worry, Margaret felt pride. This was her house, her fortress, her proof, and no one had managed to take it. The thought carried through her bones with each nail hammered, each ribbon tied. Down the street, a group of neighbors strolled past, their chatter floating up the block. Margaret caught the way their eyes flicked toward her, the way their whispers lowered just enough to suggest her name lingered in them. Once, such murmurs would have cut her, but today she only lifted her chin. She knew what they were saying, Amber's name tied to failure, to fraud, to the kind of downfall that never quite leaves a reputation. A few neighbors waved. Margaret waved back, calm but unyielding. They knew who had stood her ground. Behind her, Ryan came out carrying a mug of coffee, his sleeves rolled up, the faint smell of grease still clinging to him from the shop. He leaned against the porch railing, watching her arrange the wreath until it hung just right on the door. For a long moment, neither spoke, both staring at the home that had weathered them all. Finally, Ryan's voice broke the quiet, hushed but steady. "You saved the house?" He paused, then added with a weight that made Margaret's chest tighten. "And me." Margaret turned, her eyes soft but unwavering. She reached out, resting her hand lightly against his arm. "No, Ryan," she said. "I just told the truth." The truth did the saving. Ryan dropped his gaze, his throat working as though he were swallowing words he couldn't quite form. Margaret didn't push him. Some truths take longer to grow roots. Dolly appeared then, walking up the porch steps with 2 mugs in hand, steam curling into the cool air. She handed one to Margaret, keeping the other for herself. "Thought we ought to toast," she said, with a grin that carried equal parts mischief and affection. Margaret raised her mug, clinking it lightly against Dolly's. The sound was soft but final, a punctuation mark on months of chaos. The 3 of them stood together as the sun slid low in the sky, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and gold. Shadows stretched across the lawn, but the house glowed warm behind them, its windows catching the last of the light. Margaret let herself breathe deeply, the smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke filling her chest. For years she had carried the weight of her husband's absence, the ache of a son caught in someone else's grasp, the fear of losing not just her home but her place in it. Now, with the porch dressed for fall and the day winding into evening, she felt something she had not dared to feel in a long time. Settled. She glanced once more at the street. Amber's car would not appear. Her name might flicker in whispers, but her power was gone, stripped away by paper, gavel, and truth. Margaret didn't need to chase her down. The world had already taken care of that. Ryan sank into a porch chair, running a hand through his hair, his profile etched by the glow of the setting sun. Dolly sipped her coffee, humming under her breath, the kind of tune people carry when they've watched justice roll through and leave peace in its wake. Margaret took it all in, the quiet, the warmth, the people beside her, and felt the corners of her mouth curve just slightly. Not a smile of gloating, but one of endurance, of survival. As the last streak of light disappeared behind the rooftops, she looked at the house she had fought for and thought the words she would carry with her forever. My daughter-in-law tried to evict me from my own house, so I revealed the criminal past she hid from my son.